Well, welcome everybody. My name is Jesse Kaplan, and my colleague, Dr. Amy Fogelman, and I are pleased to present to you today on the topic of mitigating the risks from opioid prescribing, a legal and medical perspective. First, let us introduce ourselves. I'm an attorney and managing director of corporate oversight for Affiliated Monitors. Before joining Affiliated Monitors, I was the general counsel of the Massachusetts Executive Office of Health and Human Services. And I've also been a partner with Epstein, Becker, and Green, and served as chief legal counsel for a Massachusetts-based HMO. At Affiliated Monitors, I oversee assessment and monitoring services of healthcare organizations, including hospital systems, addiction treatment facilities, health insurers, and physician group practices. And Amy?
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Fogelman. I'm so happy that you all are here to join us as we talk to you today. This is a little awkward for me to kind of read my biography, but I'm a practicing physician. I'm board certified in internal medicine. I'm founder of MedLaw Consulting. I'm an expert in opioid prescribing practices, having led a multidisciplinary group of addiction experts and hospital leaders to create a first of its kind hospital-wide primary care pain policy at Mass General in Boston. I was also appointed to serve as a member of the Special Commission to study medication-assisted treatment for opioid use disorder in Massachusetts. I've been an instructor at Harvard Medical School, and I've assessed the opioid prescribing practices of scores of physicians and non-physician providers, identifying gaps in their standard of care and recommended strategies for improvement. So please, we would love to hear your questions. You can put them in the chat. We're gonna have some poll questions for you, and we're very excited. Next slide, please, for Jesse.
Thank you, Amy. So through this presentation, we hope to give you a better understanding of the legal and regulatory risks healthcare organizations and practitioners face in prescribing opioids to treat patients with chronic pain. We also hope to help you learn how to assess those risks and provide you with practical recommendations on how healthcare organizations and individual practitioners can improve their chronic pain treatment and reduce the risks from opioid prescribing. So as Amy mentioned, if you have questions, you can put those into the Q&A feature. We're going to leave time at the end to answer questions, hopefully, and or you can use the chat feature. So I'm going to begin by setting the stage with respect to the legal and regulatory risks healthcare organizations and individual practitioners face when prescribing opioids to treat chronic pain. Next slide, please. So policymakers and the healthcare industry are trying to address the opioid crisis in different ways. One is to focus on the prescribing of opioids with the goal of significantly reducing the number of people who are prescribed opioids and who become addicted or who divert legally prescribed drugs. There are a number of federal and state laws impacting opioid prescribing practices. Some of the more recent and significant developments include state laws limiting the quantity and dosage of opioids that can be prescribed and requiring providers to use and check prescription drug monitoring program databases, or PDMPs, before prescribing certain drugs to a patient. There are also more sophisticated guidelines for practitioners, including CDC guidelines, which are becoming the standard of care for prescribers. For example, just about every state has a prescription drug monitoring program, or PDMP, which is a database that tracks a patient's history of opioid prescriptions prescribed by any provider in that state. Increasingly, states require providers to check the PDMP before prescribing opioids for a particular patient. By checking the PDMP, the physician can be informed whether that patient appears to have an addiction problem, maybe doctor shopping for opioid prescriptions, maybe diverting drugs, or maybe at risk for dangerous drug interactions. Also, more and more states are passing laws limiting the quantity or dosage of opioids that can be prescribed. For example, in Massachusetts, where Amy and I both live, uh, Massachusetts was the first state to pass such a law in 2016, setting a 7-day limit on initial opioid prescriptions. And the CDC has guidelines that are targeted to primary care physicians treating adult patients for chronic pain. These guidelines are designed to improve communications between providers and patients about the benefits and the risks of using opioids, with the goal to reduce opioid addiction and overdoses. According to the CDC, the three main principles behind the guidelines are: one, non-opioid therapy is preferred for chronic pain in most circumstances. Two, the lowest possible effective dosage should be prescribed. And three, clinicians should always exercise caution when prescribing opioids and should closely monitor their patients who have been prescribed opioids. Can you next slide, please? A second strategy for addressing the opioid crisis is aggressive investigation and enforcement by regulatory agencies, both federal and state, and even by private parties like insurance companies. Healthcare providers who engage in inappropriate opioid prescribing are increasingly subject to discipline by professional medical boards. They face restrictions on their licenses to practice, and in certain cases, they've had their licenses suspended or revoked. Where patients are harmed, providers face civil medical malpractice liability. And in the most egregious cases, providers have been prosecuted both civilly and criminally, either under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the False Claims Act, or state laws. This aggressive enforcement is being conducted by law enforcement like the Department of Justice, the DEA, as well as health regulatory agencies like HHS's Office of the Inspector General. And state departments of health are also bringing actions. In some cases, insurance companies are excluding providers from their networks because of prescribing patterns or practices that raise red flags. So the question is, how are enforcement agencies, regulators, and insurance companies identifying prescribers to investigate, sanction, or exclude? The answer is all about the data, and there's a lot of data available for these regulators and insurance companies to analyze. I recently attended a virtual conference where an official from the Office of the Inspector General discussed how their office and other enforcement agencies and insurers are generating their leads for investigating opioid prescribers. He explained that the OIG has developed algorithms that look at the prescribing trends of individual providers and groups of providers. They have access to claims data for over 500,000 Medicare patients receiving opioid treatments. They may have access to PDMP data and also records of patients who have experienced overdoses. And with this data, they can analyze prescribing trends by individual providers. The trends they look at include the quantities of opioids being prescribed and the dosages of prescriptions over time. This data helps point to the providers whose prescribing practices raise red flags. And this official made the point that it's not just pill mills who are being scrutinized, but also providers who may be prescribing opioids with good intent, but in ways that are incompatible with acceptable medical practice, may be medically unnecessary, or otherwise unreasonable. And I'll give you just another example of aggressive enforcement that could involve well-meaning providers. In 2017, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions announced the formation of the Opioid Fraud and Abuse Detection Unit. This was followed by US attorneys across the country sending warning letters to physicians who had relatively high opioid prescribing histories, or physicians who may have had a patient die from an overdose, and in some cases, a patient who died for any reason within 2 months of being prescribed opioids. In those letters, the US attorneys reminded the physicians that prescribing opioids without a legitimate medical purpose or in excessive amounts is illegal, and they could be investigated and prosecuted. But of course, this begs the question, for physicians who genuinely care about their patients and are trying to treat real chronic pain, how do they ensure they are prescribing for a legitimate medical purpose or for a diagnosis where opioid treatment is both indicated and appropriate? What dosages or numbers of pills is, quote, an excessive amount that could put the patient at risk and the physician at legal jeopardy? So we hope over the next 40 minutes, we'll be able to answer some of these questions. And I'm going to turn it back to Amy.
Great. Next slide, please. So obviously, as we are all aware, COVID-19 has turned our worlds upside down. This is no different in the chronic pain arena where processes have changed. So that brings us to poll question number 1. That's our next slide, please. So I'm curious what your experience has been. Has the COVID-19 pandemic made prescribing opioids more challenging? So please choose yes, no, or no difference. We're going to give everyone a moment to lock in their answers. So I'm sorry I can't share with you the actual poll data. Unfortunately, I'm not able to share my screen. So we're going to give you a little bit more time, and then Tiffany, who's assisting us, is going to tell me what the results are. So if everybody could just lock it in, that would be great. Okay, I think we're good now. So all right. So 71% said that yes, it has made the COVID-19 pandemic has made prescribing opioids more challenging. What's interesting is that it's still changing. It hasn't ended, but around 20% said there hasn't been a difference. And I'm going to say, you know, I think it's interesting what you guys are saying. I agree in some respects, but I'm going to talk about why in the next few slides. So, you know, for all of us, the pandemic is overwhelming and very stressful, but treating chronic pain is challenging in the best of times. And the pandemic actually presents some challenges as well as some opportunities. So next slide, please. And because I did a mistake and I peeked at the poll, I'm actually not able to see the slides anymore. Okay, good. Yeah, now I can see the slides, sorry. Okay, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there are new pain guidelines issued online in April and then published in Pain Medicine in July. They were by a group of prominent pain physicians from multiple specialties, and they addressed the best practices in pain management during the COVID-19 pandemic. If you have not reviewed these yet, I highly recommend them. We could have an entire webinar reviewing these guidelines, and there are several sections, including managing opioids, that are really quite pertinent. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. An obvious change in the pandemic has been the enormous increase in the use of virtual evaluations. And so I'm going to speak a bit about how best to do a virtual examination in the chronic pain arena. So virtual exams are going to obviously be more limited than an in-person examination. You can't see the pupils that well. You can't smell the patient, which is important to give you a sense of personal hygiene clues that may not be visibly apparent. Also, doing certain maneuvers or musculoskeletal diagnoses is going to be more complicated, although it is still possible. You just need to be creative. So a few thoughts. There are tools that might be good for facilities to provide their clinicians to make things a bit easier. Like the pain guideline I mentioned above, it would be great for facilities to identify a couple new guidelines about how to do telehealth examinations and then to outline exactly what that would look like. For example, is the patient dressed? Now, obviously, the bar is a bit lower than with in-person examinations. I know I cannot be the only one of us who wears sweats as my virtual office uniform, but are they wearing clothes? Do they appear to have been taking care of their everyday hygiene? What is their movement like? Are they tremulous? What's their speech like? Is it slurred? Is it slowed? And what is their cognition like? Next slide, please. Other areas are related to just checking in and seeing how the patient is doing emotionally, because the patients are at risk for mood disorders like anxiety and substance use disorder. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to check in and see how the patient is doing with COVID. It's a good, straightforward question. And the majority of individuals are going to feel comfortable sharing this information with their physicians. If you have time, you want to check in and see if the patient has experienced any significant changes, like with employment, income, health insurance. Have they experienced a loss of any of their family members or friends who died from COVID? Because that's obviously something that's been happening and touching many of us. And then you want to remind the clinician to consider, what does the patient's locus of control seem like? And that means, does the patient feel like they have any control over their situation? Or are they just feeling really like everybody is imposing what to do and how to do it on them? Again, loss of control increases their risk for misusing their controlled substances. And so those things really need to be considered. Next slide, please. The last item that you really want to consider would be to check in about substance use. So alcohol. There's been all sorts of studies about increased alcohol purchases during the pandemic. And it feels like many of us are using this as a way to cope with the stresses that I discussed before. The combination of alcohol with opioids is a risk for all sorts of problems. Ask about marijuana use. Even if it's legal in your state, this is important. The combination of marijuana and opioids will increase the risk for serious side effects. And it's important to know. And you want to ask about other substances, including medications that are not prescribed, that they're getting from friends or family members. Many adults don't think of this as illicit use, when of course it is, and it has drastic implications for all sorts of risky side effects. Next slide, please. This slide lists some of the other main challenges that I see for prescribing opioids during the pandemic. So I asked a group of my colleagues, I said, how's it going prescribing opioids during the pandemic? And a lot of what I heard was, well, I trust my patients, and so it's going well. And this is, I call it the trustworthy trap, and it's a problem because anyone can become addicted to opioids. It has nothing to do with whether or not they are trusted by their doctors. Doctors can get complacent. They think that their patients are not at risk, when in reality, everyone is at risk. It is important to evaluate for this known side effect for every patient who is prescribed opioids. If you don't think about it, then you are certainly going to miss people who are addicted. I talked before about the lack of objective evidence and reliance of telehealth, but there's other objective evidence that's affected by the pandemic as well. So for example, toxicology screens. If the local case numbers are quite high, the risk of having the patient come to the lab to check their toxicology screen and potentially contracting COVID might outweigh the benefits of having them tested. And so tox screens may not be as readily available. Similarly, pill counts are going to be more challenging to perform in a virtual environment. And then, as I said before, patients losing their employer-sponsored insurance due to layoffs is obviously a concern for all medical care, but it also affects chronic pain management. And then there are disparities involved in the access to telehealth. For example, older patients and poorer patients may not have access to video, which furthers the health disparities that exist in these patients. Next slide, please. There are also some opportunities that this flipping pandemic has given us in this chronic pain world. So you can see the patient in their element. You get to see them in their home. You get more of an insight into their home situation by using the video visit. Also, it can be easier for some patients to check in virtually rather than traveling for a visit, which can lead to better compliance with visits for some patients. There's also some physicians they find that there's more time for them in face-to-face time with patients because there's less time where they're spending, grooming the patients or waiting for patients who got caught in traffic, and the exams are a bit shorter. There's also been a relaxation of some of the DEA rules during the pandemic, which has led to better access to pain and addiction care virtually and as an outpatient. So next slide, please. So this slide shows a timeline of some of the early major changes announced by the DEA during the public health emergency. I'm not going to go through each of these things, but just overall, I want to say that depending on your state laws, the DEA has made it easier for clinicians to prescribe opioids and to treat substance use disorder as an outpatient and virtually. So that brings us to our next slide for Jesse.
Okay, thank you, Amy. So I'm now going to discuss how you can assess the risk to your organization and the practitioners within your organization from opioid prescribing, and the tools and resources for mitigating those risks. So let's start with poll question number 2. And and the question is, does your facility have, number 1, have controlled substance policies in place? And number 2, perform opioid prescribing audits of prescribers? Answer the first one, and yes, if you have if your organization has controlled substances policies. The second one, second one, if they only perform opioid prescribing audits. The third is a check if you have both, and the fourth is a check if you have neither. Okay, hope that makes sense. And Tiffany, we'll give everyone another 20 seconds or so.
It's looking exciting.
Dun, 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 dun. We need some music. Okay. Are we getting any response? Are we getting responses, Tiffany? Okay, good. That's a yes.
So in 50% of the people, they have both. The answer was C. And 30% was A. And then it's about 10% for the other 2.
Okay. Okay. And, and I wouldn't necessarily expect that everyone on this, in this conference, on this presentation would even necessarily know whether your organization has a policy in place or conducts audits. But these are 2 very important elements of an effective opioid prescribing compliance program to both assess and mitigate the risk to your organization. So in assessing the risks to your organization and your practitioners and mitigating those risks, there are really 2 key considerations. The first one focuses on the facility or the practice and whether it has appropriate controlled substance prescribing policies and processes in place. The other consideration focuses on the prescribers themselves and whether they are carrying out the organization's expectations while addressing patient care. Could you go to the next slide, please, Stephanie? There we go. So first, the controlled substances prescribing policy. So all healthcare organizations, facilities, clinics should have a controlled substances prescribing policy that reflects the facility's expectations from its practitioners with respect to the prescribing of opioids for chronic pain. This policy should reference and be consistent with federal and state law and relevant guidance from the CDC. And it should be regularly reviewed and updated to reflect the most current law, guidance, and best practices. It's also essential that the facility not just have a controlled substances prescribing policy available for practitioners, but that the policy be communicated to all prescribers within your organization, that it be disseminated to all the prescribers, that is part of in-service training, and that practitioners are provided with the updated information and re-educated on the policy on a regular basis. One of the most important parts of a good controlled substances prescribing policy and an effective tool for prescribers and their patients is a written controlled substances agreement, an agreement that the physician enters into with a patient before prescribing opioids or other controlled substances to treat chronic pain. A controlled substances agreement will explain the risks from opioid treatment and the physician's expectations of the patient in terms of following the treatment regimen. The agreement should also set out what the provider may do if the patient doesn't follow that regimen. That might include referring the patient for addiction treatment, or if the patient is diverting drugs, it could mean terminating the patient from the practice. It's important that the provider not just hand that agreement over to the patient for signature, but that they go over it. They have a discussion, and then they document in the patient's record that the agreement was discussed, and they then have a signed copy of the agreement attached to the patient's record. This is an important tool, as you can imagine, not just to educate the patient, but to protect the practitioner and the practice in the event the patient becomes non-compliant or some adverse event occurs because of that. Providing your prescribers with these tools is the first step in mitigating the potential risks to the practitioner and the organization from prescribing opioids. The other important consideration, which focuses on identifying potentially risky prescriber behavior and then addressing that behavior, requires looking at the actual prescribing practices of individual practitioners or groups of practitioners. So how do you best assess actual prescribing to identify potential risky practices? This can involve a targeted review of a sampling of patient charts by someone who has a good understanding of when and how to use controlled substances to treat chronic pain. As you can imagine, assessing a physician's competency and decision-making in diagnosing chronic pain and then in prescribing appropriate treatments for that pain can be a very sensitive endeavor. And in our experience conducting these assessments, we have found that it often makes most sense to have someone who can be considered a highly qualified but neutral individual, not a member of the same practice or even the organization, maybe not even a peer within the state, but have someone who is truly neutral and objective and qualified conduct the assessment, make the observations and recommendations, and then share those with the medical director of the organization. The medical director can then share and discuss these independent findings with the practitioner, and if necessary, come to a mutual agreement on adjustments to their prescribing protocols, and if necessary, additional training or providing them with educational resources. If after all this, having a policy in place, implementing that policy, educating your practitioners on the policy, then auditing practitioners and addressing any deficiencies or issues raised in the audit, if you're still having problems with the provider and how they're prescribing opioids, then there's other strategies that you can use. And the next slide talks about those strategies. I'm not going to, and can you go to the next slide, please, Tiffany? I'm not going to go over each of those. But there are other things that the organization can do to address the concerns and mitigate the risk from a physician who continues to have problems with their prescribing practices. So I'm going to turn it back to Amy now.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jesse. Tiffany, let's go to the next slide, please. That brings us to our last poll question. What are the most concerning issues that you have seen at your facility regarding opioid prescribing practices. And we're going to give this a few minutes. It looks like people keyed in their answers pretty quickly. So 40% of people said, I'll give you 10 more seconds. Ooh, the numbers are moving. Okay. Okay, Tiffany, can we stop the poll? Yeah, I think I can stop it. Okay. So we have 36% of people said, oh, it's still moving, and that's very, very problematic. But around 30% said that the issues with toxicology screens was very concerning. Around 20% said not prescribing naloxone or Narcan. Another sort of 40% was ignoring, 30% ignoring evidence of misuse. And then a lower was the no corresponding diagnosis and the high-risk drug combinations. So that's interesting. I think, you know, it was interesting because when you all were first putting in all your numbers, the toxicology screen issues came up first, and then at the end, the evidence of misuse kind of squeaked out a win. But basically it's mixed. You guys have seen the different issues, and I think that you know, in my work assessing clinician treatment of chronic pain and their opioid prescribing, I've seen all of these issues. I'm now going to discuss why each of these is a problem, how it can be addressed, and what policies and protocols that practices should have in place to prevent these from happening. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first problem I call the autopilot problem. And basically, usually, a lot of times with chronic pain, the opioid was started by a different clinician in the past years ago, like 10 years ago, before the current understandings of the risks of chronic opioids. And it's just been renewed over and over again. And without consideration of why. And you can see several issues with this, including a lack of a specific diagnosis. And I'm sure you've all seen this. So, you know, the prescriber will be asked to write, maybe someone's covering for on-call, and they'll be asked to, you know, renew the oxycodone. They'll say, well, why is this patient on this medicine? And the answer may be, I don't know, it's not clear from the chart. And obviously this is a problem. So one of the most common diagnoses that I see in my reviews is chronic pain. Chronic pain is not a diagnosis that warrants such a high treatment, such a high-risk treatment as chronic opioids, because the treatment may vary based on the cause of the chronic pain. You would treat chronic gout differently than you would treat chronic migraines, for example. You would treat them with completely different classes of medications, and those are both chronic pain, neither of which would be treated with opioids, actually. So chronic pain is not specific enough. Another problem that you can see with this autopilot problem is that the patient may have a diagnosis like fibromyalgia, for example, for which opioids are no longer the recommended treatment. So this can be fixed by taking a moment to stop and reassess. So these patients should have a pain visit every so often, and the CDC specifies how frequently these patients should be seen. And you should go through these questions. Why is this patient on opioids? What was the workup? Is there a better, safer, more effective medicine for this condition? And many times when you do this review, you're going to find that the patient was started on opioids a long time ago for unclear diagnosis, and that the opioid has just been renewed over and over again without any thought as to why they were on it in the first place. And you may find that there's a more effective treatment for their condition now. Another common and significant problem that I have seen in my reviews that's really concerning are risky drug combinations. So opioids themselves carry a risk for respiratory depression, and this risk can be worse with the addition of certain medications, such as benzodiazepines. The combination of benzodiazepines and chronic opioids increases the risk for overdose and all-cause mortality. This combination should be avoided if at all possible. And a lot of times there's better choices. For example, if someone is anxious, they should be in talk therapy, or they should be treated with a medicine that gets to the underlying cause of the anxiety, such as an SSRI like Zoloft, sertraline. Now, if you were to stop the benzodiazepine, you wouldn't want to do it cold turkey. It would require a careful and a slow wean. You don't want to stop it quickly because that is very, concerning and could cause all kinds of problems. But it would also require a partnership between the patient and the prescriber. However, when you do this, when you partner with the patient, when you explain why you think that they should be weaned off the medication, when you come up with a plan, many times this can be incredibly effective. And I've had patients thank me when they're finally off their alprazolam or their Xanax because their anxiety is so much better controlled. Other medications that are risky with chronic opioids are other sedative hypnotics like sleeping pills or muscle relaxants. And recent studies have implicated pregabalin or Lyrica and gabapentin or Neurontin in a similar risk for increased death. Then there's other medication combinations that create other types of risks. So for example, blood thinners. The patient being on the opioid, that may make them more unsteady on their feet. And then if they fall, their risk for bleeding while on the blood thinner will be greater. So if there's no other treatment options, at the very least, the patient should be informed about the risk. Oftentimes, when I do these reviews, there's no evidence in the chart that there was ever a discussion of the risk of these drug combinations. And a good informed consent document should have these drug combinations included. Another common and significant issue that I've seen in my reviews, and it sounds like you all have seen at your facilities, are problems with toxicology screens. So tox screens, they're incredibly important. They're an objective piece of evidence for these extremely high risk medications. They tell you if the patient is actually taking the medicine. They may tell you if they're using other illicit substances. But the problems that I see with the tox screens is either they're not, the clinicians aren't checking them, or they're checking them, but they're not interpreting them. And that's particularly problematic when there are troubling results. So it's like it's a checklist that the tox screen was ordered, but it was never interpreted. And if you were to obtain a CBC, you wouldn't just ignore the results, and it should be the exact same things with tox screens. And the two troubling results that I have seen that have gotten ignored are, the first one is the presence of illicit substances or non-prescribed medications. So let me explain an example, a real life example. So you have a patient, you think you're the only prescriber for the patient, and you think that the only medication that they're on is oxycodone. And you check the toxicology screen, and it comes back, it's positive for the oxycodone, but it's also positive for a benzodiazepine. And so that's a little puzzling. So there's two possibilities. Either they're taking the benzodiazepine from the illicit market, which would be concerning for substance use disorder. So you would need to ask them about that and refer them if that was what the case was. Or there's another prescriber. But either of these potential causes should not be ignored. So ask them, why is Xanax in your tox screen? Is there another prescriber? And they may say, oh yes, Dr. Jones has been taking care of me for years. I never told you about Dr. Jones. Oh yeah, she prescribes me Xanax, 3 times a day. I've been on it for years. It doesn't do a thing to me. Well, okay, that may be the case, but you would still want to check to, make sure that the patient was aware that there's a risk between the combination of the opioid and the benzodiazepine, but there's also the risk for the other prescriber. And the other prescriber may not be aware that the patient is on the opioid. So you really should have a conversation with the other prescriber because they may not know. And you should, if the patient needs to stay on the benzodiazepine, you may need to reconsider if the opioid is really warranted. You shouldn't just ignore it. The other problem that I commonly see in toxicology screens is the absence of the prescribed meds. So same patient, you're the only prescriber, they're only prescribed oxycodone, and you send the toxicology screen and it's negative for everything, including oxycodone. But you see, the office may not notice that. They just notice that there's no marijuana, there's no cocaine, it's quote unquote clean. And so if this is real, the most likely explanation is that the patient is diverting the prescribed medications elsewhere. However, this is complex. Factors include the dose, the frequency, the type of the test that you ordered. And so you should discuss with the toxicologist before you accuse anyone. But if you're concerned that they're diverting it, you need to stop prescribing this medication that is going into the black market, and you need to refer to the facility's diversion protocol that is hopefully in place. So you should absolutely be following PIN guidelines for best practices, which include checking these screens, but they also include interpreting them each and every time. Another issue that I see is not prescribing naloxone or Narcan. This is a powerful opioid overdose reversal drug. The CDC recommends it for certain risk factors and for high, high MMEs over 50. I personally think that they should be prescribed to everyone. What if a pet or a grandchild or a guest in your home got into your medicine cabinet and overdosed? You would want to have this available the same way that you would give glucagon to an insulin-dependent diabetic. It's like not using a seatbelt. It's only there if you need it. And in this COVID era, it may be more challenging because people are alone. And so if they are overdosed, they may not be able to give themselves Narcan, but that still shouldn't stop you from prescribing it. It's incredibly important. The last issue is probably, for me, the most problematic, and that's ignoring evidence of misuse. And I'll say, 99.9% of doctors are incredibly well-meaning, but when this occurs, it's pretty upsetting. And, an example would be a patient who's on very high doses of opioids gets admitted to the hospital for what is felt to be an opioid overdose. You would expect that the doctor would wean the opioid, and it's not always done. Another sign of, ignoring evidence of misuse would be if the patient is requiring frequent early refills. It's usually a series of excuses. Somebody stole it, I lost it, I'm going traveling, I'm leaving early, my insurance is changing. That can be a sign that the patient is stockpiling the medications, they're misusing them, or they're diverting them. But you really should investigate this. And then the frequent dose escalations. You need to evaluate whether the underlying pain is worse or whether the patient is undergoing opioid use disorder. It is very important, once again, I'm just going to say this, to consider opioid use disorder. It's a known side effect for chronic and even acute opioid use. There should be no stigma associated with referring the patient for specialized treatment for this known side effect. There's very effective treatment. And I just want to say another word about pain contracts. Jesse mentioned this, and I totally agree with him. I mean, a pain contract is only as good as the discussion with the patient. So if you're going to have them sign a really medically and legally complex document and you're not explaining it in terms that the patient can understand, then you're not really doing a good informed consent. And similarly, if a non-physician is doing the informed consent, the doctor or the prescriber should really ensure that the person is reviewing the form in detail and just not simply asking that patient to sign here. Please go to the next slide. So this slide shows some resources that patients can take advantage of online now. There's the Mental Health America has online screening tools available that are useful for both patients and clinicians. Therapists are online, and most insurances are covering that for telehealth. And Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous have both figured out how to provide an anonymous environment for individuals during the pandemic. Next slide, please. The last two slides have some resources that are very useful in guiding clinicians and facilities to make sure that they are staying current on rules and regulations. Now, this is only a partial list, but this first slide is some educational resources in general for controlled substance prescribing education. And the next slide shows some educational resources with specific focus areas. And they're really useful, including a really great document on how to wean benzodiazepines. So next slide, please.
So I think
that brings us to our question. Go ahead, Jesse.
Yeah, I think we're ready for questions. There's also on this slide has the email addresses for both Amy and me in case anyone would like to reach out to us, please do. But Amy, it looks like there is a question, and do you see it? Otherwise, I'll read it to you.
Yeah, I see it. So the question is, would you kindly address from a non-facility based perspective? So non-hospital provider offices. So yeah, I mean, you're kind of on your own, right? And so I would recommend, if you're in the provider office and it's just you, and it may be you and another physician and a nurse practitioner and a physician assistant, you just want to make sure that everybody is on the same page when it comes to understanding what the requirements are for opioids. So the same things that Jesse talked about at the beginning are still really pertinent. So, I would make sure that there's a good pain guideline that everybody understands. There's, good protocols in place, and that everybody understands, that it's important to follow these known requirements. I don't know, is there anything else that I'm missing from that? What have you seen, Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, obviously there's the same risks, right? And the same practices, or best practices would apply, to a small group practices to a facility-based practice. But obviously the resources are different. But there are resources available for individual practice or small group practices to put into place an effective opioid compliance program and prescribing policy. And you could hire someone to come in and audit a sampling of your charts or the practices charts to see whether there are any gaps or concerns in the current practice, and then provide you with remedial suggestions and resources for improvement. I mean, Amy does that. We do that. We can put together a opioid prescribing policy and compliance program for a small practice if that were necessary. So there are resources available for small practices.
But I also just want to say it's incredibly challenging as a provider, because we're being asked to do 79,000 things in each visit. And it just, I can say it's very frustrating. It feels like, I think for a lot of providers, it's like, this is just another one, like, okay, we have to do what? We have to do this now. And it's very frustrating. And you can get a lot of blowback from your providers who might not understand why we're recommending these things. I think it works much better when they understand that it's not, I mean, some of it is regulatory, but a lot of it makes sense. It's good medicine. But it takes some education, which is sometimes a challenge. But once you can get them to understand why, then you have them on your side.
Amy, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We have some time left. So in April, Health Affairs published an article titled, "Once the Coronavirus Pandemic Subsides, the Opioid Epidemic Will Rage." And recent reports indicate a surge in opioid prescriptions during the crisis. What are your thoughts on the opioid epidemic post the COVID crisis? And what do you see as the contributing factors?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think that this is true, and this is something I worry about. Addiction risks are high due to social isolation. And we're all under enormous amount of stress with the pandemic, with the loss of control. And so we can use other, substances to help, help us cope, like alcohol, like the pain meds that were prescribed. And so again, it doesn't make the person who's having that side effect a bad person. It's just a known side effect. But yeah, alcohol sales are up and overdoses are up in many states. And unfortunately, as I said before, you can't use Narcan if you're alone. So if you're really doing your physical isolation and you're being very strict about it, you may have a problem. There's actually, in some states, first responders have been told not to carry Narcan due to a concerned risk for COVID. Although, I don't know that the data has shown that to be true. So I would say, this is challenging. But on the plus side, there's been some loosening of restrictions that have been good for addiction treatment, so that it can occur at home. And so I don't know. So that's the good news, I suppose. But many people are without their insurance due to a loss of work and the economy, and you can't participate in treatment with no insurance. And for many people, outpatient treatment is just not enough, even if they have insurance. So it's a concern, and I don't really know how to fix it. But I think that a good primary care physician or nurse practitioner who has a relationship with the patient is probably the best way to handle that, where you can be honest with each other and then refer them, when there's trouble.
Yeah. It seems to me that, if the opioid epidemic does become worse, all the more reason why having an effective controlled substance prescribing policy, in your facility, in your practice, having the pain contract, because the risk to you as a prescriber or as an organization with prescribers increases when your patients are misusing or having adverse consequences, obviously. The one thing as a lawyer that I like about the pain contract is that I can only imagine how difficult a conversation can be between a physician and a patient, particularly after they've been prescribed for opioids for a while, and then the physician has concerns that they're misusing or diverting the opioids. And if there's not a pain contract in place, if the consequences of that have not been discussed previously in advance, that must be a very difficult conversation for a doctor to have with their patient. If you've got a pain contract in place, and this is where you can blame the lawyers, right? As a physician, you can say, you know what, the lawyers for the organization, or my lawyer says this is something that is required to have this pain contract and to have this discussion with you up front. Then it makes that conversation, frankly, easier, and then obviously protects you and your organization.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jesse. I mean, I'm going back to Estee's question about, in a smaller facility, but why I got interested in this, a million years ago, was that I was concerned because when I was on call in my practice, I was noticing that there was a certain doctor who shall stay nameless, that whenever that doctor was on vacation, that I was writing a lot of prescriptions for Vicodin. And so I started wondering, what are the requirements? What's out there? And that's how I got into this whole field, kind of wondering what was there. And it was, very exciting for me to try to get that doctor on my side, because he thought he was doing the right thing for his patients. He knew his patients. He's known them for, 15 years, and, they need this pain med, and they don't have any problem with it. And it was only when it was really, when the risks were laid out, that that everybody realized, look, if we're all of us as the doctors in the practice, if we all have we're all on the same team, and we all have the same way that we're going through this, if we're all rowing in the same direction, this is so much more helpful to our patients. So I think that all of the stuff that Jesse's talking about can only be more helpful to the individual provider and physician.
So there's 2 minutes left, Amy, and it looks like there's another question from Suzanne, which is, do you think that the increase in telehealth services have added to the opioid problem? I know you discussed this a little bit, but maybe in 2 minutes you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. Most of the people that I've talked to in Massachusetts, because of some of our restrictions, you can't write new prescriptions here without going through a whole host of red tape. So I don't know what the answer is for that nationwide. It's an interesting question, but in Massachusetts, in doing my surveys of people in my practice, people are not prescribing opioids for new problems. These are just chronic opioids that have been going on all along.
Well, I think that runs up against at the end of our hour. So I want to thank my colleague, Amy. Definitely want to thank Tiffany, who was a godsend in saving us on the technical aspects of this. And thank you all for joining us for this presentation, and have a great rest of your conference.
Feel free to email either of us if you have any additional questions afterwards. Thank you.